section we're going to talk about is, so we've talked about the tissues and the types of cells that are found in the tissues. So we want to talk about the arrangement in the three separate organs of the plant. So most of you probably know that plants have roots which anchor them into the ground, or are under the soil usually, and then the stem that is holding the leaves up as a photosynthetic surface. So there's three basic organs then: the roots, stems, and leaves. And we're going to go through each one of those and say how the tissues are organized, and how they connect from one section to the next. One of the things that that we're going to do is compare the two higher level groups of plants, which are monocots and eudicots. And those I just want to give you a brief side note on the diversity of plants. We do have a lab on this, so you have a little bit of this information. But I wanted to just kind of go over just sort of a main outline of the diversity of plants, so that you know kind of where these groups that we're talking about are fitting. Basically there's two general types of plants: non-vascular and vascular. Non-vascular means that they do not have a vascular system, no xylem and phloem. They're very simple, very small, and they get all their water and nutrients from the outside environment. So they have to be very thin-bodied, and that means a couple of cell layers thick and so forth. So these are like mosses, otherwise known as bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, hornworts, those kinds of things. So these are multicellular multicellular plants. Now there's algae that are also considered plants that are not part of this list, all right? But still, they'd be non-vascular too. It's just that I'm not putting them in this group. Okay, then the next group, vascular, is divided into two groups: unseeded and seeded. Unseeded means they do not produce seeds. They're considered primitive because they don't have any structure that would produce a seed, which is mainly a flower. So they're not flowering, they're not seeding, and they generally reproduce by spores or other types of propagation. So some things that you might know that are those are horsetails and ferns. And then you have the seeded groups. The seeded groups are divided into two groups: gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms means unprotected seed, and angiosperm means protected seed. This is mainly like on a more micro level. It's talking about the integuments that are around the ovule that is part of a flower. So we will talk more about that later when we talk about flowers and flower structure. But then the two main groups under angiosperms, which is also called anthophyta, which means flowering plants. These are monocotyledon and eudicotyledon, otherwise known as monocots and eudicots. Mono literally means one seed part, and eudicot means two seed parts. When we talk about on a micro level what the seed structure is, you will see why that is. But mainly these are the two higher level groups of plants. So just some examples of monocots are palms and grasses, and aloe, things that you might be familiar with, bananas. And eudicots are most of the other larger, or not necessarily larger, but large trees that you see around, like oak trees, for example. But they are also a lot of garden plants and things that you might have in your yard. So those are the two main groups of plants that you will see around here. I think it's something like 30% monocots unplanted, and 70% eudicots unplanted. That is locally around our area. I might be a little off on that percentage, but that's roughly it. So first of all, we're going to go through the three organs. We're going to talk about roots first, and we're going to talk about their structure and development. Roots have four functions. The two main functions are anchorage and absorption. Anchorage into the ground, holding them upright, or giving some support for the bottom part of the plant to support the upper part of the plant. And then absorption, that is taking up things from the soil and distributing it throughout the plant. It also has a storage feature. That is, a lot of sugars that are made from photosynthesis will be transported to the roots and stored there as starches. And then there's some special storage structures in some plants, like carrots or sweet potatoes or something like that. Those actually have storage roots. And then there's conduction, which means that it might be making some materials like hormones or something like that, or secondary metabolites that it then distributes throughout the plant. Some examples I think are cytokinins are made in the roots, I believe, and secondary metabolites like nicotine or something like that may be made in the roots and then transported to the leaves, acting as an anti-herbivory thing. So these storage and conduction are kind of secondary features of roots, but still important. Most plants will have a primary root system, or that is a root that is initiating the growth down from the seed, and then from that will break off other roots called secondary, sometimes tertiary, quaternary roots, and those are what we call lateral roots, and those act as feeder roots. What feeder roots are usually the roots that you see in the surface, and those roots are going to be the ones that are gathering water and nutrients mostly for the plant. Even really large plants like oak trees or something like that will have a huge area that is under the soil that is what we call the lateral root system. And when they fall over, you might have seen that they have like this very large area right at the surface, and then only one or sometimes a couple of roots that are going way down deep into the soil. And that's very typical for a eudicote plant. So in one of the differences between monocots and eudicotes is a taproot versus fibrous roots. Tap roots are what I just described, one root going down first and then branching off. A fibrous root system would start by one root going down, but immediately branching into lateral roots and more lateral roots and more lateral roots. And if you've ever pulled out a bunch of grass and seen how the roots kind of hang off in a bunch of, in sort of a mass, that's what we call a fibrous root system. So anyway, that's a bit, and grass is a monocot. So tap roots are usually for eudicots, and fibrous root systems are usually for monocots. All right, another type of root is an adventitious root. Adventitious roots are roots that are growing from cuttings, and you might remember from our discussion previously that they are growing from the parenchyma of the stem if you do a cutting. But any adventitious structure is just usually growing from parenchyma cells wherever they're being generated. Okay, so let's just talk briefly right now about, there are some other root modifications, but anyway, we'll talk briefly right now about the growth of, or how a plant will start to grow. So this is a model of a root. And we are going to talk about the structures and the orientation of the different tissues up here in a minute. But right now, I want to just kind of tell you how the root is going to grow. And we talked about this briefly before, how there are meristems, or what we call apical meristems in the roots. So the apical meristem here would be like right around in here. All these cells are actively doing mitosis, and they are what we would consider initials that are then going to become derivatives back here where they continue mitosis, and then they will get larger, elongate, kind of start their differentiation into the different tissues up here. All right, and then by the time they get up here, they will be mature. So there's basically three zones in a root. There's the zone of cell division, there's the zone of elongation, and then there's the zone of maturation. So there's three root zones. Of course, in the apical meristem, these cells, as they're being laid down, are laid down, and then they're pushing the apical meristem down. Now this part are cells that can be sloughed off, and sometimes there's a little mucilage that's associated with that. It's kind of like it's a lipid. It's sort of a gooky substance that allows it to slip through the soil. So this part can be sloughed off. It's called the root cap. This is the apical meristem. And as these cells are laid down, depending on where they're laid down, they will become the different tissues. So this is going to become protoderm. This tissue that's next layer in is called the ground meristem, and this tissue that's going up the middle is the procambium. All right.